Hi everyone, welcome to Mobile DevOps is a Thing, a podcast by Bitrise showcasing developers and their processes from all around the world. In today's episode, we're going to talk about automation, optimizing workflows and release strategy, and the iOS ecosystem. My name is Noah Bezi, and I'm here today with my colleague Damian Murphy, technical sales engineer. Hey Damian.
Hey.
And our special guest today is Marcos Griselli, iOS engineer from Argentina.
Hey everyone.
Marcos, thank you so much for coming here today. We're really happy to have you in this podcast.
No, thank you for having me.
Marcos, you're not only an iOS engineer, but an open source contributor and one of the organizers of the Swiftable conference in Buenos Aires. So how would you introduce yourself, or what is something that we should all know about you?
I'm an iOS developer. I've been working on iOS for the past 6 years. I've been building apps mostly on Swift. And yeah, as you said, I did some open source in the past. I did a bit of everything, a bit of blogging, hosted a meetup here in Buenos Aires, and I was part of the team that created the Swiftable conference, which was the first iOS conference in English of the region. So yeah, I've been doing a bit of everything here and there.
As you said, Swiftable is the first English language iOS conference in South America as a whole, which is quite a big deal if you think about it, especially because it didn't really feel like a first-timer conference. It was all really professional, well-planned, the venue, and you had great speakers and great events. In general, just the whole experience was great. And I was wondering, how did you come up with this idea, or how did this all happen?
I didn't have the idea originally, actually. I was approached by the other organizers, Josefina and Facundo, who are iOS developers from Argentina, but they live in Europe. And they saw that the iOS developer community in Europe was quite close because there are so many meetups and conferences nearby. So everyone had the chance, to travel and see other speakers in action and get to meet the developers from other countries. So they reached out because I hosted a meetup here, and they say, we want to do the same thing, but in Latin America. So people from other countries come to Argentina and we get to know the community in Latin America. That was a great idea because we realized that there were so many meetups and conferences in different parts of Latin America, but there wasn't an English one that put everything together. So yeah, it was really great to see everyone's feedback from day one. Like anyone that we talked about was super excited about the idea. Speakers, sponsors, attendees. Like I think no one ever told us that might not be a great idea. Like everyone was on board and we put a lot of work into it. It was a fantastic event and we're super proud about the outcome.
Do you have plans for doing it again?
Yeah, the idea was to do an annual edition like every year, but of course 2020 has been a bit rough. So this year nothing is settled yet, but we might do an online event. We might postpone it because the great thing about the conference was being together. That's what everyone was glad about afterwards, that we did so many extra events. I think that the talks and the conference hours were of course fantastic, but what we did after hours and all the new people that we met at the event and after was like the real added value. Sometimes, online events are not exactly like that. But yeah, we haven't decided what we're going to do with it yet. We hope we can be together again soon.
Nice. Yeah, I really hope it will happen again soon and we can come back. This community aspect that you mentioned is something that I noticed in South America, that personal relationships and word of mouth and just having a strong sense of community are really important. What do you think about this?
Yeah, we used to have an iOS and Apple technologies related conference, but it was only in Spanish. And since there are not a lot of iOS developers in the region, we grew very close to the other developers we have. Like there's this meetup that we joined at a coffee place that's been running for like 7 years. And it's a smaller thing, not strictly technical. We just hang out and talk. And this conference as well, it ran for like 6 years. It was only in Spanish, and those people set the basis. And now it's not like every iOS developer in the country, but there's a good pool of iOS developers that participate in this gatherings, and people from every company. So it's usually nice to see someone getting their feet into iOS development and be able to talk with all the developers from the big companies here and be supportive of them and tell them if your company is looking for hiring and that type of stuff. But again, this wasn't a thing in all of Latin America. Like, I know a lot of devs from Argentina, but I didn't know anyone from Chile or Uruguay, or very few from Brazil. And that's what Swiftable gave us the opportunity to do, to meet people from our neighbor countries. And that was really nice.
Yeah, that sounds really nice. And you've also done some, I don't know how I would call it, like tutoring or coaching junior iOS developers. I think it's a really nice way of sharing knowledge and techniques among developers. Is this something that's common there?
I don't know if it's common. I saw a few people do it. I think it's a really fantastic way to give back to the community, because, to be fair, I basically built my whole career on developers pushing out free content out there. Like, I learned a bit of development at a company, but then like everything new that I learned it straight from Apple and their docs and their WWDC talks, or someone else pushing a video or a tutorial. And it's just crazy that you're able to build a career by learning from people that push free content. And that's like how I got to get a good job. So I try to kind of give back a little bit by doing this. And it was a good experience. And I hope more senior developers open up to answer questions or give a handout to people that's just getting started.
Mm-hmm. You also contribute quite a lot to the open source library.
Yeah, I've done a bit of open source. In the beginning, I thought that, I had like projects that I worked with where all the code was closed source, because it was a company or an app and I couldn't share any of my work. So I said like, okay, I'm going to share some code so I can show on interviews, when someone asks me something, I can send them, a link to my GitHub, and that's it. Then I kind of looked for gaining stars. I thought that was like the status that say like, oh, is your library or code good or not? Once you get popular libraries, I focused on building libraries for UIs and animations and transitions, which is, of course, a very interesting topic. And I gathered like a lot of stars and realized that has absolutely nothing to do with being a good programmer or that your library is actually good. It only means that, I don't know, it caught a lot of people's attention. So yeah, I just worked on a few tools that I thought could be useful for people that maybe I worked in my project and the company was okay with me sharing the code. Gladly this happened. Most of them are no longer that significant because Xcode came with new features and SwiftUI came out. So, libraries that deal with transitions might not be that useful in the future. Or I had a library that helped developers debug their app, like simulating multiple devices. And with Xcode previews, that is pretty much deprecated. Like, that library is not going to be super useful in the future, which I'm glad, because I don't have to maintain any longer. So yeah, I've done a little bit of it. Perhaps now I left it for a little while.
That's really impressive that you kind of front run the Apple features before they came out, right? I played a little bit around with UI collection views, and I see you have the ViewAnimator, which essentially is the same functionality. How would you compare the new APIs that Apple brought out versus, the functionality you built prior?
Like, I'm glad those libraries are no longer relevant for the future, because it means that the ecosystem gained first-party support. I think that particular library is about animating views with a cascade effect. So a table view will get all the views animated in order, or a collection view will do the same. I don't know if there's an equivalent for SwiftUI yet, but now that animations are so easy in SwiftUI, I can totally envision like they adding a modifier, on show, animate with this type of animation, and then that's it. I don't have to maintain the library any longer. So yeah, that's ultimately a good thing, that you don't have to maintain it any longer.
Yeah, and it's impressive that you were 3 years ahead of them. So that's really cool. So what sort of new open source projects are you thinking?
I don't want to say something that I'm not going to complete later, but I'm going to say it. And if I don't make it, then that's not a problem. I'm working on a viewer for SwiftUI for the iPhone that lets you test all the available modifiers on SwiftUI. That was kind of my way of saying, okay, I want to learn about SwiftUI, and there's lots of modifiers. How can I build something that's, not a simple app that also lets me understand more about everything? So yeah, I'm working on this little app that lets you lay out a button and then choose whatever modifier you want from a list. I don't have all the modifiers available yet, but ideally I'll have like a good amount of modifiers that anyone can just drag and drop and try, and see how SwiftUI works under the hood, because it's not the same if you call padding before setting the background color, or the fact that you can have multiple modifiers, like you can have padding and padding and background again to create some sort of double background layout. So I think that's pretty interesting and perhaps a bit hard to understand when you come from the UIKit word. So yeah, I'm working on an open source app that will let users do that.
Oh, that's really interesting, and it always is a challenge. You kind of have to trial and error when you're using these new features to actually see what they do, right?
Yeah, I wished I dived into learning more in a step-by-step manner, but I just jumped into the problem, and banging your head against the wall sometimes is the way to go.
Yeah, definitely. How are you managing your Swift libraries that you've built so far?
What I do is most of them have the exact same release process. So of course they are hosted in GitHub. They all have the same, as I said, they all have the same release problem. I use Fastlane to do like automated releases. They all have tests. So I use Bitrise as my CI for running tests with each PR. And when it's time to release, when a few fixes and features have been merged and we decide it's time to push a new release, I have this Fastlane lanes that take care of bumping the pod spec version, because they're available on CocoaPods. So I have a pod spec file. They bump the pod spec version. They create the git tag, and they push the content and create a new release inside GitHub. So that is pretty useful. Like, I messed it up a couple times before setting the automation. I would have like a release with nothing in it and say like, oh, I pushed the release before actually pushing the tag, or that type of stuff, that type of errors when you get started with releases. So once I got the hang of it, I said like, okay, this is super error prone if you're going to do it manually every time. And I had 4 or 5 libraries at the time. So I got started with those scripts or with that Fastlane setup. And now like everything new that I do gets that release from scratch.
Oh, very cool. So you're kind of doing a full circle, right? You push your pull request, you merge it into master, and then you can tag a release from Bitrise back into GitHub. Awesome.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that I'm working on at the moment is automatic versioning for Swift libraries. That's something I've done at my work. I'm in charge of dealing with the CI workflows. It's not actually in charge, but I got started with it and I really started to enjoy it. Whenever I have some free time from coding features or fixes, I'll put on the CI hat and try to create some optimizations. And one thing we did is like we created a new library a couple of weeks ago. And of course, with every new library, you start to push like a lot of new features and fixes constantly. Every day or every 2 days, a new release gets done. And that started to cause some problems with our previous setup, because we had a setup where every pull request needed to set the new version value. So I send a push with version 1.0, and then you send a pull request with version 1.1. And when there's tons of features being added fast, that can be troublesome, because it gets like your release gets merged before mine, your PR gets merged before mine. So now my versioning is out of sync, which of course it didn't happen as often with our previous setup, because we use it on a stable library that got like few fixes every week or every other week. So yeah, I came up with this way to generate a Swift API, like the public API, using this tool called Source Kitten that lets you interact with the Swift AST. What we do is with every push to master, we regenerate this API file, this public API file. And if there are changes to the public API, then that means we got a breaking change and we need to release a new major version. And if there are no breaking changes, if there's no deletions, but there's public additions, that's an additive change and we do a minor release. And if nothing changed in the public API, then we just do a patch release. So yeah, that's super exciting. Completely remove the need for versioning for our developers. It wasn't that of a problem, but being able to just push code, and that's something that I know that with CocoaPods can be slightly problematic from time to time. But yeah, it's looking really good so far.
I wanted to ask something about your release strategy. Do you think that there's an ideal frequency of releases, or do you think the faster the better? For example, if you want to fix bugs, you might need a different strategy than when you want to push new features. And I was wondering how you decide what's an optimal frequency.
I don't think I mentioned it, but I'm working at this software company called Hirsch Group, and we do music apps, music learning apps, for ear training or sight singing training, which is super exciting. But at the same time, it could be a bit troublesome to determine when you push new features or when you push your bug fixes, because there's so many things you could do in this area. Like there's always something you can improve, or you can increase performance when you're, detecting sounds or setting which notes were played, or like there's always room for example. What we like to do and has been working for us is to release every 3 weeks. And even though 3 is an arbitrary number, having a limit for when you have to release has proven really useful for us, because when we got started, we just said like, okay, we want to push once we have significant changes. And when you do that, you enable yourself to extend the release date every time something new comes up. And there was always, a really nice feature we were about to add or some bug fixing we were doing. And sometimes our sprints, would last for, instead of 2 or 3 weeks, they would last for 4 or 5 weeks, because we were so close to pushing this new incredible feature. And then someone find a bug and we had to go back and fix it. So yeah, I think that being super strict about when you have to release, and whatever gets to that release gets to that release, and whatever doesn't make it to that release is just pushed over to the next one. And being okay with that, I think it's a really important thing when you're planning your releases.
Do you have some best practices to keep up with user feedback or like App Store ratings and comments?
Yeah, we try to do a lot of feedback early. We have musicians testing the app constantly. We try to get them a build like the closest to a release candidate as early as Monday. The week before we're planning to release, we usually plan releases for Monday or Tuesday. So if anything breaks, then we're going to be at work the other day. We try, not to release on Friday, so we're not expending our weekends fixing bugs. So yeah, we try to get as much feedback as possible from our musicians and our beta testers on quite some time before releasing. So in that way, we're able to catch problems as soon as possible. And we sometimes even send like development builds for a specific feature that needs, a lot of testing. And we are very clear about what type of build they get and what to expect from it. If a development build doesn't have every feature working, that's totally fine. We try to make sure that they only test what needs to be tested. So that got us like pretty good results over this period of time.
You mentioned testing. So are you doing unit testing, integration testing, like end-to-end testing? What sort of testing do you guys do?
We do a bit of everything. Of course, unit testing is a critical part of, I would like to say, any software development team. And we also do with music apps, sometimes it's a bit hard to test, to automate like the core testing, because you cannot do like recordings on the simulator, on CI, or locally on tests. So it's a bit hard to track like when to simulate a user playing the piano or a user singing, but everything else, we try to add tests for it. And we also do screenshot testing, which proved to be super useful from time to time. And we also have UI tests to make like a whole suite testing, which Apple provides all the tools. I know there's a lot of frameworks out there that let you do the same and maybe even in a faster way. But, we decided to stick to Apple's technologies. So we get whatever they release on the new Xcode version or on the improvements, like you get them for free. So that's been a good investment. And yeah, we try to do the whole suite, maybe not run them every time because of course, UI tests are pretty slow and screenshot testing is not super slow, but it's not as fast as snapshot testing. That's what we do. Snapshot testing is not as fast as unit test. So we don't run them every single time. But yeah, we try to keep our code base well tested.
And how do you decide when to run your UI tests or your snapshot tests?
We're now running snapshot tests all the time, and we are doing UI tests when there's like significant changes to the flow. Of course, we set this up like dynamically. If a certain amount of files get changed or if files in certain folder get changed, we do trigger like the test for UI tests. And of course, before making a release branch, we will run them, or every release branch runs them. Like that's when we want to make sure that everything works. Because, if you're going to run your tests for 20 minutes, 25 minutes, because you change, one line in a string or in a calculation, then sometimes, your unit test already covers that case in 100%. So maybe you want it to get it fast and merge. So yeah, we do it dynamically, and that's pretty good as well.
Wow, really advanced stuff.
Yeah, well, is that once you get the hang of CI and how it works, you're the user of it, right? When you work as a developer on a team that uses CI, you're constantly like dogfooding your own implementation. You'll send PRs every day, and from time to time you say like, oh, well, I wished this was faster. I wish it didn't run this test this time. I wished it report back the errors on the tests straight into GitHub. Once you start to get the hang of it, it's really not that difficult to add all of that. For example, one pain point with the snapshot testing for our team, which is a small team, so it's not like we have someone dedicated to our tools, our CI all the time. So we do what will give us the most benefit for lower time invested. One pain point with screenshot testing was the fact that if the screenshot failed, you had to go into the CI, into Bitrise, and download the images from the apps and artifacts tab, which is, again, not complicated, but it adds an extra step. And we say like, well, wouldn't it be nice if it tells you, exactly which test failed? And since we already have the screenshot that failed and the difference, it will post it, as an image on the PR saying like, hey, I tried to run the test and this unit test failed and this screenshot test failed with this screenshot. And I was expecting this other one. So, straight from the PR, you get everything ready to go back into it on your code and fix it instead of having to navigate the CI logs and download everything. And I think that's really powerful.
Very cool. So you're basically using Bitrise to comment on the pull request with the test that failed and the screenshot.
Yeah, we use this tool called Danger, which was originally a Ruby tool. I think it's written in Ruby, but it has a Swift implementation as well and JavaScript implementation as well, which acts as an intermediate between the GitHub API and the team. So it has the ability to comment in your pull requests, access the GitHub APIs as well. So yeah, we use that to send whatever comment we want.
Very nice. Do you think, having the ability to run, iPad and iPhone apps on the Mac will actually expand the potential user base, maybe increase revenues for app developers?
Oh, that's a good question, because I'm not sure. Like, I'm a heavy Mac user, and I wouldn't like an iOS or iPad app to work exactly the same. What they pictured at WWDC this year was, a straight port from an iOS app to the Mac that required tapping. like clicking with the trackpad or your mouse. As a heavy user, you expect another type of behavior on the Mac. And one thing that I'm not certain how it's going to work is, are these apps going to be available for downloading straight into macOS with no extra payment? Let's say you bought the app on the iOS, then you will be able to download it on the Mac. I think that's a delicate subject, which might not be great for developers, because if it works on two platforms, then you should probably purchase two different apps or two different licenses or whatever. And the developer that created the iOS version maybe wants to do a Mac version with support for, I don't know, shortcuts or better system integrations or a lot more features that they could add to the iOS version. So yeah, I'm curious to see how everything will plan out with this particular feature.
Yeah, and definitely the route now to building Mac apps has definitely widened for iOS developers in particular. I know with Mac Catalyst and Universal apps that a lot of people that are mobile developers are now desktop developers as well.
Right, having the ability to build Mac apps with SwiftUI is just it opens the gate so much more, because AppKit was a completely foreign framework for iOS developers. Perhaps, well, not that foreign, but it means relearning a lot more things. But with SwiftUI, we got this app example called Fruta app, which builds for iOS, iPadOS, and macOS. And even though it has its problems or its layout issues or bugs, it's a great first step to building great Mac apps with SwiftUI, or at least building parts of the app where SwiftUI will shine. Maybe not 100% of your app, but there's a lot of places where using SwiftUI is really convenient.
So Marcos, I'd like to go back a little bit to when you were talking about your team setup. You've done quite a lot of freelancing and remote work, and there are a lot of people involved in these projects, like musicians, testers, and designers, etc. And when you start researching DevOps, one of the first things that comes up, like every article mentions it, is the close collaboration within the team and with other teams. So if I understand correctly, you work a lot with people you've never really met in real life. So how does this work in your case?
One of the things about this mobile DevOps thing is that this is kind of a new concept. Like, we didn't used to have good CI/CD infrastructures a few years ago. It's kind of newish, and I recommend that any developer that uses CI on their team gets their feet wet with CI and play around with it and see what they could do to improve their team's productivity. And with regards to the remote working, it's funny because in 2020, basically everyone became a remote worker, right? All the developers, at least on my Twitter timeline, switched to remote working, and I've been doing this for the past 5 years. And everyone is fascinated that they don't have to commute anymore. But it has its perks and it has its negative aspects as well. You basically never leave the office. Your computer is a few steps away from you. Even when you're chilling after work and you get a notification, then you're one step away from sitting down and trying to fix that bug you got reported. So I think it's very important, to draw the line there. With regards, the collaboration, as you mentioned, we work with musicians and we work with product people and we work with designers, which we cannot expect them to know a lot about Xcode and about building our features or PRs on their own devices. Of course, we rely on TestFlight to send out builds from time to time. But again, that process is not always very intuitive, because you get an app version and maybe you're not sure what you need to test, and the test notes are presented once. So one thing we do to increase this is that we enable builds from PRs. And what we do is, like, we host them on Bitrise, since we already use Bitrise to test everything. Those PRs that are tagged are labeled under build, like should create a build. That's something that we do on CI as well, to dynamically decide if we should do a build or not based on GitHub labels. and we will generate a build for a specific PR, usually for big PRs that change, add a new feature or fix some critical functionality. And we will send them over to the product people and the musicians. And these little builds, we add them like the PR number to the app icon. And we set the PR number on the bundle identifier as well. So they always know what they're exactly testing, even though they're not aware of what the PR is or the technical terms behind it. They just get a build that has a different icon, so they already know exactly what they're talking. And any feedback that they send back will be sent with this new bundle identifier that references the PR exactly. So that's a great feature for everyone, because when we send one of these builds to the musicians, they just look at the app icon and say like, oh, I had a problem in the app icon that has the number 1,000. So, oh, okay, we know it's the PR 1,000. That's it. Really helps us out debug problems faster and be more productive.
So we're pretty close on the tail end of WWDC, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on features that excited you from WWDC. Anything that you've tried since it was released.
Yeah, I like of course, the updates to SwiftUI. I think that's like the big milestone for any iOS developer coming into the future. Maybe we're perhaps not ready to use it 100% right now, but let's remember that the framework was released just 1 year ago, and it doesn't make sense to ask for absolutely every feature being done on version 1 or version 2, mostly because if you get a framework that tries to do everything at once, then you'll probably be stuck with those errors in the long term. I'd rather get incremental updates that work correctly, and new types like, I don't know, the new color picker is really nice. And I bet that if they had that same implementation 1 year ago, they would have released it, but maybe it's better to wait a bit longer and get like something that works great out of the box. So the improvements to SwiftUI, of course, app widgets and app clips are really exciting technologies. And some people might say like, oh, we already had that on Android a while back. And I think that's fine. I don't get caught in the mobile OS wars. I think if it's released right now, it's because of a reason, and app clips right now makes a ton of sense with signing with Apple and Apple Pay, even though it's not available here in my country. I think now that feature with the ecosystem at this point makes a lot of sense. Of course, the ability, having ARM Max is just like Apple Silicon. The Apple Silicon chip is just super exciting for the future. I know some folks already have the DTK available, the developer toolkit, and have been playing with this Mac Mini that has an iPad Pro chip at their homes. And of course, they're not available to say anything, but that's super exciting. The ability to run iOS apps on the Mac, it's super interesting.
Nice. And do you have some other tools in mind that would help facilitate this collaboration? Like not necessarily CI.
Not right now. I know there's a lot of tools that let you submit your builds and have a bunch of testers download it and push release notes and everything. But we like to use whatever we had already set up. So it was super simple to set all this up with Bitrise, and whatever we need to scale or to change, we can do it manually without depending on third-party services.
We've talked a lot about different things in the mobile space, and I'd love to get your thoughts on, what sort of future trends of mobile development you see coming in the future, maybe, the next year or the next 5 years, next 10 years.
Of course, I'm going to talk about the Apple ecosystem because that's what I work with and that's what I'm more experienced with. And the future it's really bright. Like, with every new release, even things that are not yet there in the mainstream, like things like ARKit. A couple years ago when they released the first version, one would say like, oh, this is a nice tool for games or for prototype apps. but things are starting to get really good with tracking. Now you can track stuff behind real objects, and that raises the question: is, are we going to have those VR glasses that they've been talking about, like the rumors been talking about? So that would be like the craziest jump in how we think about interfaces and user interaction as developers. I think being part of that jump would be super excited, because of course, SwiftUI and all those new frameworks and being able to build Mac apps with SwiftUI is super exciting, but it doesn't really change the core underlying of how the app works. Like, the user will not care if the app is built in SwiftUI or if it's built on AppKit or UIKit. Like, of course, you'd probably be able to push features and fixes faster, but like something that comes to change everything on the user experience side, I think that's like the thing I'm excited about the most for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, definitely. I used to build a lot of augmented reality apps, in the early days of smart glasses. And, at the time, this was around 2014, it was just a very kind of hyped area. The hardware hadn't really caught up. But, seeing now the advancements in the processing capabilities and how that Apple are able to occlude objects like you were mentioning, I can really see it. Like right now, it's actually at the point where it's a viable solution to a problem. So I really do think augmented reality is gonna take off quite a bit, even in the enterprise space. Augmented reality for warehouse picking, right? So you can imagine somebody picking items to send them off via a package. Having an augmented reality heads-up display can really speed up their working process. So I definitely see augmented reality hitting the enterprise space quite big, and definitely the mobile gaming space as well. It's just a super fun thing to actually take that game off your screen and throw it onto your floor and let your kids play with it, right?
This is a question we ask everyone. How would you describe your job to your parents?
Oh, that's a good question. I think they didn't really understand what I was doing for the first year or 2 years, because they didn't used to have smartphones when I got started into iOS development. Once they got into iOS, they started to know more about apps and what they do. So they got the hang of it. But for 1 or 2 years, it was Marcos does software. That's all they knew. Like, that's all they understand from it. It didn't really matter if it was app software or web development or websites. They just said the word software until they got the hang of it and were able to show their friends, no, he works on mobile apps, specialized on iOS development, and creates stuff like this or that. So it definitely took them a time to understand it.
Yeah, it's funny because my mom keeps thinking that we are selling mobile phones. I'm like, no, it's the software. And she's like, but how do you take out like so many mobile phones to Japan when you go to the conference? It's really difficult.
Yeah, it sounds like a difficult thing to explain. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, people don't really get the fundamental difference between building mobile apps and writing mobile apps, right? And that's always hard, right? Because you explain to them, I help people build mobile apps, but we don't actually go in and help you write the code. We just help you create the installable artifact, test the app, things like that. And so that's always a challenge, just to kind of level set people on what exactly it is.
Some people have an easier job at explaining this. Anyway, so another thing I wanted to ask, if you could talk to your younger self, not that you're super old, but what would you say to your past self? Like, what advice you would give yourself?
I thought about this in the past, and one thing I wish I've done earlier was investigate more about the different career opportunities and what different people are building in different spaces. Of course, it's natural to think like, oh, I wish I started developing when I was younger, so now I would have a lot of years of experience and I'd be more proficient. But of course, that sometimes it's not the case. And I would suggest two things to people that's just getting started. Is number one, and by far like the more important thing that I wish I've done when I got started, is to reach out to the community, to get to know other people that are doing the same. I remember I joined the first meetup I went to. I was already like 3 years experience into the job, and like meeting with so many people that does the same thing as you and goes through the same processes, and understand what it's like to be fixing bugs that you cannot understand why things are not working. Was a really nice experience, and of course I made a ton of friends. So that's my number one recommendation, to reach out to communities. Everyone is, at least the iOS community or the people that I've met, are wonderful people and super open to help out someone that's just getting started. And Twitter is a great service for this. There's like a lot of people willing to help out. Yeah, I'll stick to that recommendation. Yep.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I guess you also need to be kind of extroverted to be able to reach out, or need a bit of courage. But I guess with time it becomes easier.
Yeah, but once you get over that barrier, you realize that everyone else is, in the same spot, or was in your spot a few years ago. So they're super understanding about someone asking questions or wanting to get better. And in fact, like, I love when someone reaches out and say like, hey, I'm just getting started. Would you point me out to what can I read? What can I learn? And yeah, that, like, I'm excited to answer those type of questions.
Oh yeah, that actually brings me to the next question about what would you recommend as a learning material to people?
Oh, this is the best part. Like, there's so many good content out there. There's so many free content. There's paid content as well, but like, there's so many people sharing stuff online. I personally always recommend, Mengto courses. I used to work with him at Design Plus Code. There's always Two Straws, which is Paul Hudson, which has this blog called Hacking with Swift, and he pushes so many free content out there. He has books as well. There's this person, Jordan Singer. He's like recreating Apple apps with SwiftUI. And like, he pushes a new app open source every day. And it's just insane, like the amount of content you might get from Twitter or from GitHub just by following these people that, they push code out there. And it's like exactly the same code that we do on our day-to-day work. It's like exactly what we're paid to do. You can learn it from these people pushing free content out there.
That's really cool. I didn't even know about the last one. Yeah, I'm familiar with Hacking with Swift, of course. So do you have any really interesting plans for the future?
Yeah, I guess I would like to focus on the community more. I would love to push more content out there. I have my own website with my blog, and of course, you cannot do absolutely everything, so I don't push much. But I would love to push, more contents, push more videos explaining things, especially this type of CI things that could really benefit, small teams. Maybe I understand that big companies have dedicated teams for this, but small teams could really benefit from this type of content. I wish I could, put a bit more effort into generating content for people that's getting started with it, because that's exactly how I built my own career and made a job out of reading other people's posting stuff online.
Damien, do you have any questions?
No questions. Just really appreciate you chatting with us and talking us through all these cool ways that you're using Bitrise, and seeing all the progress you're making in the open source space, and having all of those projects validated by Apple actually introducing it out of the box. I think it really shows that you're a thought leader in the space, and a super promising future I see ahead.
Thank you, Damon.
Thank you so much again for coming here today. Thanks everyone for listening. You can follow Marcos on Twitter at Marcos Griselli. Check out his projects at mar.codes. These will all be in the show notes. And stay tuned for the next episode. Bye.